The morning Celestine Ward inherited $100 million, she called her husband of 9 years, handed him a garbage bag, and told him to be gone before dinner. He packed slowly, deliberately, and on his way out, he paused at the front door, turned to look at the house one last time, and smiled in a way that made her stomach tighten, though she couldn't explain why. 3 weeks later, she would understand exactly what that smile meant, and by then, it would be far, far too late. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. If this is your first time here, we are so glad you found us. Please take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? New York? Texas? London? Lagos? Canada? South Africa? We read every single one, and we love knowing you're out there. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. Celestine Ward was 38 years old when her life, as she understood it, cracked open at the seams. She was the only child of Reginald Ward, a man who had spent 40 years building a mid-sized but enormously profitable industrial packaging company in the Midwest. Ward Packaging Solutions was not flashy. It did not have a celebrity spokesperson or a Silicon Valley origin story. It made the boxes that hospitals used to ship medications, the canisters pharmaceutical companies sealed samples in, the sterile containers that held things nobody wanted to think about until they desperately needed them. It was boring, essential, and worth approximately $220 million at its last independent valuation. Reginald had been sick for 3 years. A quiet man who kept his finances quieter. He had told Celestine very little about the specifics of his estate, only that she would be taken care of. She had taken that to mean she would inherit everything. She was not wrong about the amount. She was catastrophically wrong about the conditions. Her husband, Dorian Cass, was 35. He was not rich. He was not from money. He had grown up in a small industrial town in eastern Ohio, the son of a machinist and a school administrator, and he had clawed his way through a state university on partial scholarship, studying supply chain management because it was practical and because it was something he was quietly, genuinely gifted at. He and Celestine had met at a conference in Chicago 9 years ago. She had been attending on behalf of her father's company. He had been a junior logistics consultant. They were an unlikely match on paper. She was polished, private school sharp, and used to rooms bending toward her. He was measured, observational, and rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. But something between them had worked, at least for a while. They married 18 months after they met, in a small ceremony at her father's estate outside of Columbus. Reginald Ward had shaken Dorian's hand at the reception and said, quietly and only once, "I hope you understand what you're stepping into." Dorian had said he did. He was not entirely telling the truth, but neither was he lying. For the first 4 years, the marriage was functional and occasionally warm. They bought a home in a suburb north of Columbus. Celestine's choice, her father's money as a down payment. Dorian built a modest consulting practice. He was good at what he did, untangling supply chain inefficiencies for mid-market manufacturers, the kind of companies that had been running on 20-year-old systems and hemorrhaging money without knowing exactly where. His work was unglamorous and well compensated, and he was careful with what he earned. The trouble started not with a dramatic event but with a slow, grinding shift in the architecture of the marriage. Reginald's health began to decline in the couple's 5th year together. Celestine became increasingly consumed by her father's world. The company, the estate, the lawyers, the financial advisors who circled an ailing patriarch like patient birds. She had never formally worked at Ward Packaging, but she began attending board meetings, inserting herself into conversations she had previously shown no interest in. Dorian watched this happen with a certain quiet understanding. He did not resent it. He had, in fact, been expecting something like it. What he had not expected was what came with it, the subtle and then not-so-subtle recalibration of how Celestine saw him. He noticed it first in the way she introduced him at company functions. "My husband, Dorian, became Dorian. He does consulting." The pause before consulting lengthened imperceptibly over months. At dinners with her father's business associates, she began speaking over him, not aggressively, but with the practiced ease of someone who had quietly decided that his voice carried less weight in certain rooms. He noted all of this. He said nothing. He kept working. In the 7th year of the marriage, Reginald Ward had a serious episode. A cardiac event that left him hospitalized for 11 days and visibly diminished. It was during those 11 days that Dorian, who had been managing the logistics infrastructure of a company called Harkin Medical Distributors as a contracted consultant, was offered a full-time executive role. Chief Supply Chain Officer. It was a significant offer, real equity, real title, real responsibility. He accepted it quietly, told Celestine that evening, and she had nodded and said, "That's good," in the tone one uses when someone reports mild weather. What Celestine did not know, could not know because Dorian had told her almost nothing about the specifics of his work, was that Harkin Medical Distributors was not merely a regional player. It had been, for the past 2 years, in active acquisition discussions with a privately held logistics technology firm. The deal had stalled. Dorian had been, in fact, one of 3 people in the country brought in to consult on whether the acquisition made structural sense. His recommendation, delivered in a 40-page report 16 months before he accepted the executive role, had been the deciding factor in the deal moving forward. He owned a quiet, non-publicized stake in the outcome. He had signed confidentiality agreements so thorough they covered even spousal disclosure under certain conditions his attorney had made certain were airtight. He had not lied to Celestine. He had simply not told her everything. There is a difference. It is not always a comfortable one, but it is real. Reginald Ward died on a Tuesday in March. He was 71 years old. He died at home, in the study where he had always done his best thinking, with a copy of a John Steinbeck novel open on the side table and a cup of tea gone cold. Celestine flew to the estate the moment the call came. Dorian followed 2 hours later. The funeral was small and precise, the way Reginald had lived. The reading of the will happened 8 days after the burial, in the offices of Ward's estate attorney, a methodical woman named Harriet Osei who had worked with Reginald for over 20 years. Dorian was present. There was no particular reason to think he needed to be, but Harriet had sent a request for his attendance, and Celestine had barely registered it, assuming it was procedural. The first section of the will was as expected. Celestine inherited the primary estate, a sum of liquid assets, and controlling interest in Ward Packaging Solutions. The total inheritance, once assets were liquidated and structured, would come to just over $100 million. The number, when Harriet read it aloud, landed in the room like a stone dropped into water, quiet at the point of entry, then spreading outward in every direction. Celestine's expression did not change. She had been raised not to react to numbers in public. But something shifted behind her eyes. Something settled. Something that, in retrospect, had been waiting a long time to settle. The second section of the will was where Harriet paused, took a breath and said, "I need to read this next portion carefully, and I ask that no one speak until I've finished." Reginald Ward had, it turned out, been a careful and watchful man to the very end. He had not disliked Dorian. He had, in fact, done something far more unusual. He had studied him. Quietly, over 9 years, with the same methodical attention he had given to every business relationship that mattered to him. He had noted the way Dorian managed money. He had watched the way Dorian handled difficulty, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that requires you to absorb it silently and keep moving. He had also seen, with the particular clarity of a man whose time was running out, what was happening between his daughter and her husband in those last few years. He had seen Celestine shrink Dorian in increments. He had seen Dorian allow it with a patience that Reginald recognized, not as weakness but as strategy. In the second section of the will, Reginald Ward did something almost no one in that room had anticipated. He did not give Dorian money outright. He gave him something worth considerably more than money. He gave him a seat. Specifically, Reginald had established, 14 months before his death and without Celestine's knowledge, a formal advisory trust structure around Ward Packaging Solutions. Under this structure, a transition oversight trustee was required to hold a voting seat on the board during any period in which the company underwent a change of primary ownership or a significant strategic transaction, including acquisition, merger, or sale. The trustee held this seat for a mandatory 36-month period. The seat could not be vacated by the inheriting shareholder without unanimous consent of the remaining board members, 3 of whom had been with the company for over a decade and who had, it turned out, respected Reginald Ward enormously. The named trustee was Dorian Cass. There was a long silence in the room after Harriet finished reading. Then Celestine said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, what?" Harriet set the document down with the careful neutrality of someone who had delivered difficult news before and intended to deliver it with dignity. "Your father appointed your husband as Transition Oversight Trustee for Ward Packaging Solutions. The appointment is binding. It is not contingent on the status of the marriage, and it carries a mandatory 36-month term." Celestine looked at Dorian. He was looking at the table. His hands were flat on its surface. He was very still. She called him that night, 2 hours after they had driven home in separate silences, and she said things that cannot be fully repeated here. What they amounted to was this: she believed he had engineered the provision. She believed he had manipulated her father in his final months. She believed the entire 9 years of the marriage had been a calculated climb toward the Ward fortune. She told him he was a fraud. She told him she had always known something was wrong with him. She told him to pack his things and be gone by morning. She told him the house, which, it was accurate to note, was in her name only, having been purchased with her father's money before the marriage, was no longer his to occupy. He packed. He left. He said almost nothing. At the door, he turned and looked at her, and he said, "Celestine, read the rest of the will." Then he walked to his car and he drove away. She did not read the rest of the will that night. She called her lawyers instead. If you've made it this far and this story has your full attention, drop the words "still watching" in the comments right now. We want to know who's locked in with us. Because what happens next, what Dorian had been sitting on for the better part of 2 years, is the part that will genuinely make your jaw drop. The divorce papers arrived at Dorian's temporary apartment, a furnished short-term rental in a Midreese downtown, on a Thursday morning, 11 days after he had left the house. He read through them with the same focused attention he brought to contracts. His attorney, a compact and very precise man named Theodore Farrell who specialized in high-acid dissolution, sat across from him at a small kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. "She's going for a clean split," Theodore said. "Minimal acknowledgement of marital contribution. She's positioning it as a short-duration, low-entanglement marriage given the asset discrepancy." Dorian nodded slowly. "She expects me to fight it. Most people would. I know." He picked up the pen. "Let her have the house. Let her have the joint accounts." There was roughly $68,000 in those accounts. He wrote that number off with no visible emotion. "I want to respond to the petition within the week. No counter-demands. Simple acknowledgement." Theodore looked at him carefully. "Dorian, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. Go ahead. Is there something I don't know yet?" Dorian set the pen down. He looked at the stack of papers in front of him, and then at the window behind Theodore, where the late morning light was coming in flat and gray. "There are a few things," he said. "I'll have them to you by end of week." What Theodore received by end of week was a secure document package that took him most of a weekend to fully read. When he called Dorian on Sunday evening, his voice had changed. It had the particular quality of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation in real time. The Harkin Medical acquisition had closed 6 weeks before Reginald Ward's death. Dorian's equity stake in the outcome, structured through a holding entity he had established 3 years prior on the advice of a financial planner, had vested at closing. The value, after taxes and fees, came to $4.3 million. It was sitting in an account that had existed entirely outside the marriage's financial ecosystem, not because Dorian had hidden it from Celestine in bad faith, but because the confidentiality terms of the consulting arrangement had explicitly covered disclosure during the period of active negotiation, and by the time it closed, the marriage had deteriorated to the point where Dorian had simply, carefully, legally, not introduced the information into a joint context. It was his, entirely, unambiguously, legally his. A family law attorney reviewing the structure would find no marital property claim on it. Theodore had checked this 4 times. He checked it a 5th time that Sunday evening just to be sure. But that was not the most significant item in the package. The most significant item was this: Dorian had, during his tenure as Chief Supply Chain Officer at Harkin Medical, identified and helped develop a proprietary inventory routing protocol that had been formally patented 18 months ago. The patent was held in the name of a small LLC that Dorian was the sole member of. He had licensed the use of this protocol to Harkin Medical as part of his employment arrangement. The licensing fee, structured on a royalty basis tied to Harkin's annual logistics volume, was currently generating slightly under $200,000 per year. The patent had 12 years remaining on its term. Theodore sat with this information for a long moment. Then he said, "She has no idea any of this exists." "No," Dorian said, "and her lawyers certainly don't." "Not yet. What do you want to do?" There was a pause. "I want to do this correctly," Dorian said. "Every step. Everything above board. I don't want leverage. I want accuracy." Theodore understood. The distinction mattered deeply. This was not a man preparing to attack. This was a man who had been careful for a long time and was now simply allowing the truth to take up its full amount of space. He signed the divorce papers, returned them without a counterpetition, and waited. Celestine's attorneys had, by this point, begun the process of restructuring Ward Packaging Solutions under her ownership. This was where the Transition Oversight Trustee Clause began to show its teeth. The clause was not symbolic. Reginald had written it with the help of Harriet Osei and a corporate attorney who had spent 30 years in industrial business succession. The trustee's seat came with real rights: the ability to review and formally comment on any proposed transaction over $5 million, the right to request independent financial audits of any operational division, and a mandatory consultation requirement before the company could be taken through a sale or merger process. None of these rights required Dorian to obstruct anything. They simply required that he be present, informed, and formally acknowledged in every significant decision. Celestine's team had moved quickly to attempt to challenge the appointment. The argument they brought to the county probate court was that the clause had been inserted at a time when Reginald Ward's mental capacity might have been compromised by his illness. It was a reasonable argument. It was also, unfortunately for their case, directly contradicted by the fact that Harriet Osei had ordered a formal cognitive capacity evaluation 14 months prior to Reginald's death, at the same time the trust amendment was drafted, and Reginald had passed it with a clarity that the evaluating physician had noted was above average for his age and health condition. Harriet had known this challenge might come. Reginald had known it too. The probate motion was denied within 60 days. Meanwhile, Celestine had attracted the attention of a private equity firm out of Atlanta called Forsyth Capital Partners, which had been quietly circling Ward Packaging for the better part of a year. They were interested in acquiring a controlling stake, perhaps the whole company depending on the valuation, and integrating it into a larger industrial packaging portfolio they were assembling. It was not a bad deal. It was potentially a very good deal. Celestine wanted to move on it. The board, with Dorian's seat now formally recognized, required a mandatory review period and full disclosure to the trustee before any letter of intent could be countersigned. This meant Dorian got to look at the Forsyth Capital offer in its entirety before it moved forward. What he found was instructive. The offer was structured in a way that, on the surface, appeared straightforward, a clean acquisition at a valuation of $140 million. But buried in the deal structure were performance adjustment clauses that tied 22% of the purchase price to a 3-year post-acquisition revenue benchmark. If the company hit those benchmarks, Celestine received the full amount. If it didn't, and given Forsyth's track record of aggressive post-acquisition restructuring, there was a material argument that it wouldn't. She stood to receive somewhere between $15 and $30 million less than the headline number. Dorian filed a formal trustee observations memorandum. He did not attempt to block the deal. He simply documented, with precise and thorough citation, every material risk he had identified in the offer structure, including 3 comparable Forsyth acquisitions from the past 7 years where the contingency clauses had reduced seller proceeds significantly. He recommended independent representation for Celestine in renegotiating the contingency terms. He attached the 3 deal comparisons as exhibits. The memo went to the full board. The board, composed largely of people who had worked with Reginald Ward for decades, and who were not unsympathetic to the elder Ward's apparent faith in Dorian's judgment, read the memo carefully. Then they voted to delay the Forsyth LOI pending renegotiation of the contingency structure. Celestine received a copy of the memo through the corporate disclosure process. She read it in her car, in the parking structure of a building in downtown Columbus, on a Tuesday afternoon, and she sat there for a long time afterward without starting the engine. The memo was not hostile. It was not gloating. It was precise. It was protective of the company's value, and therefore of her inheritance. And it was exactly the kind of rigorous, careful analysis that her father had apparently believed her husband was capable of providing. She called her attorney. "How is he doing this?" Her attorney said, carefully, "He's doing what the appointment requires him to do, Celestine. He's doing his job." The moment everything became public happened at a quarterly board meeting held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus office building. Celestine had, through her attorneys, made a final attempt to have Dorian's trustee status formally stripped on the grounds that the divorce created an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Dorian's attorneys had submitted a 30-page rebuttal. The board had engaged an independent governance consultant to evaluate the question. The consultant had concluded, after 6 weeks of review, that the trustee appointment was ironclad, that divorce did not constitute a conflict of interest under the terms as written, and that any further legal challenge to the appointment would likely fail and would potentially expose the company to governance liability. The board meeting was not supposed to be the setting for a confrontation. It was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. But Celestine arrived with 2 attorneys, a financial advisor, and an expression that had been building pressure for 4 months. Dorian arrived alone. The meeting proceeded through its agenda items with the uneasy formality of a room that knows something is about to happen. When the agenda reached the Forsyth Capital update, Celestine's lead attorney stood and delivered a prepared statement challenging the basis of Dorian's memo, arguing that his analysis reflected personal interest rather than corporate duty. The statement was forceful and professionally delivered. When it was Dorian's turn to respond, he stood up, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and said almost nothing at all. He simply placed a folder on the table and said, The exhibits speak for themselves. I am happy to walk the board through them again if needed. Then he sat back down. The board chair, a 60-year-old woman named Constance Bell who had been with the company for 22 years and who had adored Reginald Ward, picked up the folder, opened it to the first page and read for a moment. Then she set it back down and said, to the room, "The trustee's analysis prevented this company from entering a deal that would have cost its primary shareholder between $15 and $28 million. I want that stated clearly for the record." She looked at Celestine, not with cruelty, but with the bluntness of someone who has earned the right to speak plainly. "Your father trusted this man with this seat for a reason, Celestine. It would serve you to think carefully about why." The room was very quiet after that. Celestine looked across the table at Dorian. He was not looking at her with satisfaction. He was not looking at her with contempt. He was looking at her with something harder to name, a kind of exhausted clarity, the expression of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in the correct place. She had called him nothing. She had called him a fraud, a climber, a man with no real standing in any room she occupied. She had handed him a garbage bag and told him to be gone by dinner. He had gone. He had said almost nothing. He had done his job. The Forsyth Capital deal was ultimately renegotiated, with the contingency clauses restructured to remove the most significant downside risk. Celestine received an improved offer that locked in $131 million in proceeds with a minimal performance holdback. It closed 8 months after the quarterly board meeting. Dorian's trustee obligations formally concluded with the completion of the sale, as the terms of the appointment specified that the transition period ended upon finalized disposition of the company. He filed his final trustee report, signed the transfer documentation as required, and walked out of a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon into an overcast Ohio sky, and that was the end of it. He was 36 years old. He had $4.3 million in a private holding account, an annual royalty income from a patent that had 11 years and change remaining on its term, and an executive role at a company that had just become part of a larger, better capitalized organization that valued what he did. He had no debt. He had a furnished apartment he had grown fond of. He had, by most honest measures, more than enough. The divorce finalized 2 weeks after the acquisition closed. Celestine kept the house. She kept the joint accounts. She retained the full inheritance. The settlement was clean and quick, because Dorian's attorneys had filed for precisely what he was legally entitled to and nothing more. There were no dramatic revelations in the settlement proceeding. The attorneys signed, the judge approved, and it was done. Theodore Farrell walked out of the courthouse with Dorian and said, "Most people would have fought harder." Dorian thought about that for a moment. "I fought the right things," he said. He never told Celestine about the patent. Not because he was protecting a secret, but because by the time it would have been relevant to say anything, there was no longer a conversation to have. She had made her decision about who he was in the first hour after reading the will. Everything that happened afterward was simply the world correcting itself. What she had believed was that the will had revealed a man who had been calculating from the beginning. A man who had befriended her father, won her hand, waited patiently, and then collected his winnings when the time came. What the will had actually revealed was a man her father had watched for nearly a decade and had concluded was the most honest person in his daughter's life. Reginald Ward had not left Dorian the trustee seat as a reward. He had left it because he believed, based on 9 years of quiet observation, that it was the right thing for the company and, though Dorian would not have put it this way, for Celestine. He had wanted someone watching over what he had built. Someone who would not be dazzled by the number. He had chosen correctly. There is a moment in every betrayal, and what happened here was a betrayal, make no mistake, where the person doing the betraying believes they have completed an act of power. Celestine Ward stood in the doorway of a house she owned outright, an inheritance she had always expected finally in her hands, The man she had quietly diminished for 3 years finally diminished completely, or so she believed. She had the house. She had the money. She had the name. She had won everything she had aimed for. She had not aimed at the right things. The things she had missed were not dramatic. They were not hidden in offshore accounts or secret second families or elaborate conspiracies. They were the ordinary, accumulated results of a man who worked carefully, kept his word, read the fine print, and built his life with the same methodical attention he brought to every supply chain he had ever been hired to repair. He had been, from the beginning, exactly what he appeared to be. The mistake she had made, and it is not an uncommon one, was to look at a quiet man and see emptiness, where in fact there was only patience. Reginald Ward had seen something else. He had seen it clearly. He had written it into a legal document and signed it and had it witnessed and filed it with an attorney who had worked for him for 20 years, and then he had died, and the document had done exactly what he had designed it to do. Dorian Cass never went back to the house. He didn't need to. He had never, not once, mistaken the house for the point of anything. Friends, we have reached the end of this story, and before we let you go, we want to sit with it for a moment because this one carries something worth keeping. The lesson here is not about money, though money was certainly at the center of it. The lesson is about what we choose to see in the people standing next to us. Celestine Ward looked at her husband for 9 years and decided, when the stakes rose, that he was a backdrop, someone occupying space in a story that was really about her and her family's legacy. She was wrong, and the cost of being wrong was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic reckoning. There was simply the slow, daily revelation that the person she had dismissed was, in every room she had ever put him in, the most prepared person present. Dorian never gloated. He never needed to. That, perhaps more than anything else in this story, is worth remembering. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life you may have underestimated, or someone who may have underestimated you, please leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts. We read them all. And if you believe someone else needs to hear this story today, please share it with them. Sometimes a story finds you exactly when you need it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now and turn on the bell so we can bring you the next one. Every story we tell is for you. Thank you for being here, friends. We will see you in the next one.